Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to episode 256 of the On Air Advocate, where at the On Air Advocate, we look to provide education, support, and empowerment for all of those with different abilities, mental and medical illnesses, and their caregivers. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Tammy Flynn, and I am the host and producer of the On Air Advocate, and I am super excited if you're here this afternoon joining us, or whether you are catching this on the replay. Now, as always, if you think any of the stuff we are talking about today could be relevant or helpful for anyone in your network or your circle, please hit the share button and share the love with others. Well, if you guys have been following us at the On Air Advocate all month long, you know that we are in a Marfan Awareness Series because it is Marfan Awareness Month. And so I am so excited to have here today Allison Pullins. She is the volunteer at the Marfan Foundation, and she has so much to share with us today. So welcome, Allison.
Thank you, Tammy. It is my pleasure to be here. I admire your work and what you're doing with this show and with your platform. So I'm really honored to be a guest today.
Yes, and you are the third in the series that we've been doing. And so we kind of started it out where we were getting to know Marfan. And then last week we were talking with another mom of how you can kind of connect in the community, with others. And now you are bringing it to us from that mother's perspective, having traveled the journey, and you are continuing to travel the journey yourself. With your family. And so before we dive into that, since you haven't been on the platform before, can you just let everybody know a little bit about Allison?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm so glad to be here. I'm Allison. I live in San Francisco, California with my husband, Neil, our two children, James, who's 5.5, and Naomi, who's 3, and a dog, a very senior dog, whose hearing has diminished greatly, so you probably won't even hear him barking. Professionally, I have worked with hospitals and medical groups over the past 15 years, particularly on the physician transaction side. I run a company based in Burlingame, California, that helps hospitals and medical groups determine appropriate compensation and contracting with doctors. So I'm very familiar with healthcare in general. 3 years ago, my life was completely transformed when we found out that James, our oldest child, has Marfan syndrome. And so that's why I'm here today, to talk about that experience and to share some insights that I've gotten. But Tammy, as you mentioned, I'm on a journey, and I'm at the beginning of my journey. There are hopefully many decades to come of learning and change.
Yes, and I know that we were chatting before the show. We both have children with complex medical conditions. And so looking that your son is 5, you didn't get the diagnosis just recently. There was kind of some unfolding of some different symptoms and whatnot that led you to it. So can you take us to the beginning part of the journey of you guys discovering that he had Marfan?
Absolutely. Hindsight's always 2020, but honestly, James was born with some of the physical clues that something was different. I was a first-time mom, so I really had no idea what to expect. But when James was born, he had these incredibly, I think, beautiful, long fingers, which were not what my husband and I had. His body was just kind of I describe it as floppier than many babies, but I didn't really know. I was just trying to keep him alive and focused on being a first-time mom. And so when James was about 9 months old, our very observant pediatrician said, I kind of noticed something off with his eyes, and I think you should consider going to an ophthalmologist to have him checked out. And so we went, and at the time, the ophthalmologist said, look, James's vision is fine. I don't see a lazy eye, which is what the pediatrician thought he could have, but why don't you come back in 6 months? I just want to monitor it. And, thank goodness she did, because when we brought James back in 6 months, his vision had rapidly deteriorated. He went from having relative 20/20 vision to needing about a -4.5 prescription.
Wow.
So yeah, it was, and the doctor, whom I adore, she's so amazing. She was so careful in ensuring that his optic nerve was okay. There wasn't any retinal damage. There wasn't. It was just this crazy shift in his vision. And so we put him in glasses, but every 3 months we'd go back to the ophthalmologist. And over the next, year and a half, it just kept getting worse and worse and worse and worse, to a point where he was old enough to do a particular test that needed his concentration of focus, which he couldn't do until he was 2.5, almost 3. And when we did that test, we found out that it wasn't the shape of his eyeball that was causing the myopia. It was the shape of his lens in his eyes. And that's very rare, very rare. And so it tipped our ophthalmologist off to, this kid might have a genetic condition, right? And once she referred us to a geneticist, who then promptly referred us, even before we visited this geneticist, to a cardiologist to get an echocardiogram. Typically, when a physician suspects Marfan syndrome diagnosis, one of the very first things you do is get that echocardiogram, because, as I'm sure you learned in your previous Marfan podcast, aortic root dilation is probably one of the most serious effects of having one of these connective tissue conditions, specifically Marfan. And sure enough, when we had an echocardiogram, James does have aortic root dilation. So his clinical diagnosis came very fast. We ended up getting a genetic confirmation, and the geneticist thought he probably has Marfan syndrome, but we should make sure it's not Loeys Dietz or another, associated condition. And so sure enough, he has Marfan syndrome. And that was confirmed in June of 2018. So it's been almost 3 years.
Almost 3 years. And I'm certain, because that's a very, like you were saying, short amount of time. So yeah. You must have been feeling like you were going through a hurricane, a whirlwind, like, okay. As you were telling us that you are in the medical industry, even with that, I always find that when people are throwing all those things, it's still all that investigation. It's that same feeling like, oh my gosh, what's going on? What do I need to do next? What should I be investigating? Even if you understand the lingo a little bit better than a layperson would.
Totally. Tammy, I'm glad you brought that up. I felt really fortunate to have the background. My father is actually a physician as well. I knew about Marfan syndrome before James was diagnosed. I did have that understanding, which was when why the cardiologist came into the echo lab and told us that James's aorta was dilated. I immediately burst into tears, because I knew exactly what that meant for this was serious, this was very serious. But the unfolding and unpacking of the implications and the specifics and the clinical implications of James's diagnosis, you can't learn that in an instant, it takes time. And so right when our cardiologist was telling us about that he likely had Marfan syndrome, we needed to check it out, but he felt pretty confident James did. He said, look, the Marfan Foundation works with patients and families that have this condition and, associated connective tissue conditions, and you should really go check out their website. It's marfan.org. It's, go look. And literally that afternoon, after we got home from the hospital, instead of decompressing, because I'm just not that kind of person, I was immediately, Googling and on the Marfan Foundation's website, learning just as much as we could. And we were so fortunate that a month, so James was diagnosed in June. In July, the Marfan Foundation was having their annual conference 45 minutes from our house. It was fate. And so my husband, we didn't have childcare at the time. So my husband drove down on day 1, and then I drove down on day 2. So immediately we were just embraced by this community. We learned so much about Marfan syndrome during that weekend, and it really set us up with the baseline knowledge and understanding we needed to feel empowered and feel like we knew what was happening so that we could, think about what to do next.
Right. What I think, as what we discussed earlier before we got on the show, is that one of the things that you can't really plan for, and there's no educational class on, is emotionally, as a parent, as a mom, how you're going to process it and deal with all these things that you are finding out, and then especially for those also that have siblings, right? So a lot of times for parents, when they get diagnoses, they don't just have that one child. They have, multiple children, and how is that going to transform the family, and in what
Yeah.
way? And so, what did you find in that space? So you've gotten the diagnosis, yeah, and you already have some of that medical knowledge too. You put all the pieces together. You went on, and I'm sure you spend countless hours at your computer. Sometimes we shouldn't look at our computers, but under every Google site, and checked it all out. Went to the conference. Now you have all this information, and you feel like you're empowered. But now there's all the mom stuff and the transformation,
Yes.
and change,
Yes.
and all of that. And so, tell me how that kind of played out.
Oh, that's a big one. So I think one of the fascinating realizations I had was how differently my partner, my husband, and I initially dealt with this diagnosis. Neil has a PhD. He's very academic. He ran to the research, and he ran hard to the research. I mean, like, he read all the papers. He did it all. I did that to some extent, but pretty early on in this journey, I started to have really deep, profound, nagging questions that were more spiritual in nature. Like, what does this diagnosis mean? Why James? Why me? Why us? How can I put one foot in front of the other? In my nightmares, I would think about one of my kids dying. It's like one of those terrible, horrible, fleeting thoughts that as parents, you really can't prevent, right? And after this diagnosis, I was thinking about James's mortality like every single day. It was this radical reorientation of life as I knew it. And it was sad. It was really sad. If I got in my car alone and drove for more than 5 minutes in the months after James's diagnosis, I would be crying because I would be alone with my thoughts. And that was really scary. It was really scary. At the same time, I had James when I was 33. I have always been a motivated person, but my life kind of lacked purpose, for lack of a better word. And I started to realize in the months after the diagnosis, and I didn't know exactly what it was, but I felt this like spark inside me that I never had. And I thought, gosh, I think my purpose is this. And I had heard people say, oh, you have the children you deserve, or you get the children that you need. And I started to see, like, there's a reason why James is our child. There's a reason for him. There's a reason for us. And so I started to reframe the conversation in my own mind. I had this very traumatic experience. As you said, it happened really fast. It's not like car accident fast, but it's fast. And I was reeling from that trauma. I was experiencing a lot of grief. But I started to see like this glimmer of hope and purpose that I really never had experienced before.
Through all of it. And then from that point, do you feel like that was recently, or do you feel like, for the last, you feel like this is because this is a short period of time because your son's 5, basic diagnosis was like 3. So do you feel working through all of that, did that take you a month, 6 months, a year? Because I feel like, my son's 23 and I feel like it took me like 10 years to work through some stuff.
I have always been a person that's dealt pretty well with change. And I think it's because I am quick to accept I'm quick to forgive. I'm quick to accept. And it took me probably a year to really absorb all of this and truly get it and walk over the coals. It took me about a year. That being said, the nature of Marfan syndrome and chronic illness is cyclic, right? Like I got over the diagnosis period in a year, but I'm going to have periods in my future when James needs really intense surgical procedures to prevent death. That's going to be like a whole nother mountain that I'll need to climb and accept. And so I have built the foundation. I have accepted his diagnosis. We are living with it now. There will be challenges to come, but I feel like we're as prepared as we possibly can be for that, kind of nebulous and unknown future.
Yes. And what would you say to other parents that possibly have just gotten the diagnosis, whether it be Marfan or it may be a different diagnosis syndrome, of kind of like the best practices? We were talking about things that you do that you feel really have helped you along the way to stay in this positive frame of mind.
First of all, I'd give them a hug if I could physically be with them. Because I feel like for special needs parents and for parents that have gone through a diagnosis like this, you don't even need to say anything sometimes. You just look into their eyes and connect with them, and you have this connection, because a lot of this journey, it's more what you feel with your heart and not necessarily with your mind. I would say, to newly diagnosed parents, I usually say it gets better. Like the initial trauma and just understanding and learning, it's so much. And so with time, I usually assure people, with time, you'll get the skills and you'll develop your toolkit of what works for your family. I also encourage people, I have a friend and colleague whose daughter has cystic fibrosis, and she said to me, the faster you truly accept that this is the way it is, like this diagnosis is here, the better it's going to be for you and ultimately for James. And I think that's really great advice. The thing is, though, you can't rush acceptance. And everybody has their own process they go through. I was very fortunate that I was able to go through mine in a relatively short amount of time. But every parent is different. Some other advice I would give people, and all of this sounds really trite, but I mean it. First is take care of yourself, because if you, in order to be a good mom or dad, you have got to be on your A game, and particularly with kids with special needs, because when an emergency comes up or when they are finally ready to have a conversation with you about something important, you need to meet them where they're at. And you cannot meet them where you're at if you're exhausted or hungry or you need exercise, right? So I would encourage parents to really understand, okay, how do you take care of you? Prioritize that. And then you're going to be able to take care of your kids. And, the last thing I'll say is gratitude. Gratitude is a very powerful practice. And, we've been dealt a hand of cards that would not win you a poker game. But James, despite his condition, is an incredibly lucky kid. He is very privileged. He has access to resources. He is going to be okay. And I always think about that, and it's a value we're raising both the kids with, not just James, but with Naomi. Like, everybody's got something. And so having a chronic condition in our family has expanded our ability to be compassionate, be empathetic, and ultimately, I hope, be better humans, because we understand these challenges that people face. And I will also say, when you, and I know I'm just piling on here, but I'll stop with this one. When we found out this news about James, I suddenly wanted to connect on a much deeper level with people in my life that had undergone terrible things, death, illness. I really, I could talk to them in this raw, more vulnerable way than I could have ever done before. Um, and yeah, like I went through a lot to get there, but I'm so grateful to have that now because I can much more truly meet people where they are and really feel their pain, um, and support them. And I'm not sure I could have done that, or at least done it so early on in life, without this experience.
Definitely. Yeah, so it's embracing that new normal and finding that acceptance. But yes, there is so much to be said for that. As you've traveled the journey, you finally see with your eyes clearly, like, oh my gosh, the empathy you have for people that are struggling and going through this just it just soars because we can say we understand. Oh yeah, my mom, my mom's friend's a caregiver, or this person helped for my uncle or whatever. But unless you're doing it and you're living it, and you're at the hospital all the time, and you have all of these studies and things that are coming back about your loved ones, you really don't know what the journey is, till you're there
Yeah.
traveling.
Yeah. Yeah,
Exactly.
I mean, I can't watch a sappy TV commercial anymore without bursting into tears. I feel like my like heart, and I wasn't like that before. I feel like my heart cracked open,
Mhm.
when we got this news. I mean, when you become a parent, you go, like you basically are broken, right? Like your kids leave this, um, you know, a beautiful scar, but they leave a scar on you. Like it's very bittersweet to be a parent. There's a lot of loss in parenting, but this diagnosis just like, broke it open even more. And while it has its negative effects, by and large, it's net positive. This is being a human is growing. You grow, you change, you learn. And this is just one of those, it's Marfan syndrome and my son's condition is one of those major milestones in our life's journey that will affect everything. But it's really taught me a lot. I think tough times in your life can end up teaching you more than you may realize.
Yes, and giving you that purpose. I always say pain to purpose for so many different things in our life. Now, just a quick question. Your son did get diagnosed pretty quickly, but what is the average length of time it takes for diagnosis? So, because I know that viewers that also watch the show, some of them have you know what I'm saying? They have searching for their genetic condition that they have, but they just haven't found out what that is yet. People go to multiple doctors. Is it pretty straightforward with Marfan that most people are diagnosed, pretty quickly if they're showing the signs, or it just really depends the doctor you're going to, if they're aware of it, the state you live in, whether there's as much good care there that, if a doctor hasn't seen it before and had exposure to it, they're not going to be referring you to,
Yeah.
you
I
know.
I wish I could tell you that diagnosis is swift, in every single case of Marfan syndrome, but I cannot. And our story is very exceptional.
Okay.
Marfan syndrome is incredibly underdiagnosed, and it's because the condition manifests itself differently in every individual, even individuals that have the same mutation. A dad with the same mutation as his son could have severe cardiovascular impacts, and the son might not have anything. And we have some inklings as to why that happens, but we actually don't know the whole story. And so, unfortunately, 30 years ago, oftentimes people were diagnosed with Marfan syndrome when they drop dead of an aortic aneurysm, where their aortic root that's dilated like James, breaks apart, and it's a very painful death. No one wants you don't want it. And still to this day, that's how people are being diagnosed. Their mom or their dad, dies because of a dissection, and then they go, and it turns out not only do they have Marfan syndrome, but their brothers and sisters do too. So diagnosis can be a journey. And it can also be like Marfan syndrome is one of the more common connective tissue conditions and genetic aortic conditions, but there's a whole umbrella of these conditions that are even more rare. And sometimes it's hard to figure out, okay, do you have Loeys Dietz? Do you have vascular EDS? It can be a challenge to actually arrive at that particular diagnosis. And it takes a lot of persistence. So for those of you listening who suspect you have a connective tissue condition, but you're really having challenges, I urge you to just keep going and find a provider that will listen to you and has experience. Because at the end of the day, you are the one that knows your body or your child's body best. So I encourage people to go with their guts and keep trying hard. And I really, it breaks my heart that people have to do this within our healthcare system to fight for these things, but just keep going because it's worth it.
Yes, definitely. Just when you were talking about that, there's so many conditions that you don't find out about quite, what I'm saying, quite that quickly. But and even with this, with Marfan, sometimes it may take someone, their family not knowing, and they might not know till they're an adult, correct? Like you were saying.
Absolutely.
And they'll know that their children have it and all of those other things. So you definitely, if you see any differences, continue to ask those questions, and the hope is that, a doctor, a medical professional will hear that, or you'll do enough of your own research for that to be figured out. Now, resources. The Marfan Foundation has so many amazing resources. I mean, it's like a one-stop shop.
It is.
And so can you kind of take us through the different resources that you found the most useful as you are like, what's next for us?
It's a tough question only because there are so many to prioritize this stuff. I would say, like, at the beginning, information that the Marfan Foundation provided on their website and at the conference we attended was vital to understand, the more clinical implications of James's condition and what we could expect medically moving forward. Also, just basics as to like, why is it that his aorta is dilated? Like, we wanted to know the biology. We want to know these reasons. We're interested and curious. And so many people who have been diagnosed with connective tissue conditions or their families want to know this info, and they deserve to know it. And the Marfan Foundation has everything. And the other thing that's so great about the foundation is they are able to connect you with experts. And that was just invaluable to us. We could talk to the preeminent researchers and physicians that work with connective tissue patients, and that access, and these doctors and clinicians are so willing to talk to you. It's great. Like, the community is so strong. The other resource that has been good and in a post-COVID world will continue to be better and as James gets older, and that's finding other kids that have Marfan syndrome and other related conditions and making sure James is able to forge relationships with those people, because I'm his mom. He's going to get older. He's not going to want to talk to me about a lot of stuff, right? But if he has a good friend who's maybe a couple years older than him, has gone through, aortic root surgery, dating with Marfan syndrome, like all those things that, like, he can't really talk to me about because I'm his mom and I don't have Marfan syndrome, like, he's going to meet people that can help him and become lifelong friends. The other thing that I invest a lot of time volunteering for the foundation, raising money, not just for James, but for everybody with these conditions and future people. Because for me, I want to ensure that we are developing better therapies, better drugs to eliminate surgical procedures one day. I have a vision of a world where people with connective tissue conditions are living not just long lives, but quality of life is better. And so that's why, and the foundation is funding cutting edge research so that one day we may get to that future, right? And so that's why I am so invested, because like I want my child to live a life as pain-free as possible. And I want his children to have that as well. Now that Marfan syndrome is autosomal dominant, which means that regardless of James's future partner, his children will have a 50% chance of having Marfan syndrome. So those are my grandkids and great grandkids. So I am invested in ensuring that his family can lead healthy, productive lives. And the foundation is a way that I can work on that problem. They're solving these challenges with us. So I'm very grateful for their support.
Yes. And, I always like to remind people the show, as I've been doing the show through the pandemic last year and into this year, is that even though we're in the pandemic and there's COVID, it doesn't change that people are being diagnosed with different syndromes, diseases. It doesn't mean that heart attacks are still not like the number one thing that people are dying with in America. Like, we need to be looking at these syndromes, conditions, and still giving back to these organizations. I mean, for research, because, that though the pandemic is an issue, this is an issue that touches every single person, and every person's family in some way, with different syndromes, conditions, and medical. So, just make sure to not forget. I know so many different organizations went to having to do their banquets and charity events and all that kind of stuff as virtual. And so it was a whole new world. A whole new
world. And we have shifted our strategy at the Marfan Foundation to engage our community and awareness. Last year, we took our annual Walk for Victory virtual. And while I was bummed to not see people, in the flesh and walk around Golden Gate Park on a sunny spring day, it was still important that we got together. And, honestly, like, people have been incredibly generous during the pandemic. Like, we've seen increases in giving. People are really, I think people agree with you, Tammy, that we still need to be looking at this longer term vision. We still need to be investing in research and awareness. And people are, putting their money where their mouth is. And not to mention, like, emergency, as you said, heart attacks still happen in a pandemic. Like, it's so important that people with these special health considerations not be afraid to go to the hospital if you're having an emergency. My son he was playing on the playground at school in September, broke his foot, tripped over a ball. And, I didn't hesitate taking him to the ED. I knew he had to go. And at UCSF, we both felt incredibly safe there, and they took such good care of him. So it's important that we continue to get healthcare, obviously taking the extra precautions, because it's, you could have a life-threatening situation.
Yes. So we need to all keep doing that. I hear that just rung so much with all the doctors that are on. They're just like, we need to keep taking care of ourselves. And you spoke about self-care, even the parents that are the ones taking care of their kids that have different medical needs. They need to be taking care of themselves as well. So with that, we are going to drop below the information for the Marfan Foundation so people can easily access that. And Allison, before we log off for the day, is there anything you would like to leave the audience with? Any final thought? I know I didn't ask you this beforehand. It's like a trick question. No, it's a final.
I will oftentimes talk with parents who will say something like, and it's really with the best intentions, will say something like, gosh, I just can't imagine what it's like to have a child with all these serious medical conditions. So I've been a parent without a kid with serious medical conditions because I didn't know. And I've been a parent with a kids with special needs. And you, as a person, as a parent, you can imagine it, because parenting is just hard. Being a mom, being a dad, it's the most rewarding thing, I believe, but it's also one of the hardest jobs ever. And just because my kid has special health considerations, it's not that my job is harder necessarily. It's more like sometimes I feel the stakes are a bit higher, like, oh, I've really got to ensure my child is responsible, because if he forgets to go to the doctor or take his medications, that could have serious effects, right? So it feels like the pressure might be a little harder at times, but honestly, like as a parent, we're all in this together, regardless of, our particular situations. And anybody that cares for, I mean, not even parents, if you care for another human being, if you love somebody else unconditionally, whether it's a parent or a sibling, you can feel this inside of you. And so I encourage people to, like, if you have friends going through difficult circumstances, jump in with them, love them as much as you can, and understand that, like, regardless of the specifics, we're all in this together, and we got to rely on each other.
Most
So,
definitely.
and Tammy, I just want to thank you for doing this series on Marfan syndrome. It is so important that more people know about this condition, because, as I mentioned earlier, it's really underdiagnosed. So if this podcast in any way makes you, like, look at yourself or look at a friend or a child and think, I wonder, I feel like we've done our mission today.
Yes, definitely. That is one of the things, is as I even do these shows and I have a son with complex medical conditions, I'm like, did they miss something here? Or that sounds familiar. And I've gone back to our doctors and asked. So if any of those things, definitely, this definitely drives that awareness. But I appreciate you so much, Allison, for being here today. You are so correct. There is no manual to being a parent. We should make one. Better.
I think we're both pretty bright, but I'm not, and very experienced. I mean, you have 4 kids, but I'm not sure we could pull that together. It's a pretty tall order.
I know. But I thank you for spending the part of your afternoon here with us and sharing. You guys want to know more about the Marfan Foundation? It's marfan.org, correct?
Yep.
And we will drop that below. If you guys want to know more about the On Air Advocate, you can head on over to onairadvocate.com and you can find all of our resources right there. So with that, you guys all have a fabulous day. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Thank you.